The house was still holding its breath when I woke. Not quiet the way mornings usually are, but a deeper kind of stillness. The kind that makes you look over your shoulder before you even leave the room. I could feel the cold through the floorboards as I walked to the kitchen, the kind of cold that hadn't been there the night before. The sun hadn't climbed over the pines yet. The kettle hadn't even warmed. But the table, that was the first thing I noticed. There, right in the center, sat a folded note. Daniel always left his messages on the counter by the bread box, quick reminders about groceries or when he'd be home. But this one was different. Its edges were pressed flat like someone had smoothed them with both palms. I could still feel the faint warmth from his hand when I picked it up, as if he had left it only moments before. His handwriting greeted me first, steady, simple, familiar enough to soften something in my chest. He apologized for leaving early again, said the mill needed him before first light. He wrote he loved me, and the words were gentle the way he spoke when he was tired. Then my eyes fell to the last line. I didn't feel myself sit down. It was written in a tight, narrow script, trembling at the edges. The letters leaned too far right, rushed and tight. Daniel didn't write like that. Not even on his worst days. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. My fingers went cold. For a long time I just stared at it as if the ink might rearrange itself into something safer. The house felt different now, like it was listening for my reaction. I held the letter closer, trying to make sense of the two hands living on one page. One calm. One scared. And neither telling me what I needed to know. The morning felt heavier after that. I walked through the house as though something might shift in the corner of my eye. Daniel's coat was gone from the hook. His boots too. But the air felt wrong. A draft where there hadn't been one before. A faint scent of cigarette smoke that didn't belong to him. I found myself opening the drawer where he kept all the old letters he'd written when we first moved to the lake. Little notes about firewood and fishing days and the new life we were trying to build. I laid them out on the table beside the new one. His handwriting stayed the same over the years. Open, careful, patient. The last sentence on the current note wasn't just different. It was frightened. Someone else had touched that paper. I turned it over, studying the faint pressure marks pressed into the back. Whoever wrote that line had pressed hard, harder than Daniel ever did. Hard enough that for a moment, I imagined a hand jerking across the page while the writer watched the door. I didn't realize how long I'd been staring until the light changed on the wall. The sky was turning pale and foggy. I stepped outside, still holding the letter. Daniel's truck was gone, but the tire marks carved deeper than usual into the gravel as if he'd left too fast. The fog clung low to the ground, blurring the fence posts and the neighbor walking his dog. He waved, but his eyes lingered too long on my face, like he sensed something off. I dialed Daniel's number. Straight to voicemail. I drove to the mill because it was the only place he could be, the only place that made sense. The gravel lot looked unfinished in the half-light, sawdust touching everything like yellow frost. Reed, the foreman, startled when he saw me coming. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He told me Daniel left early. Long before his shift ended. He didn't sign out. Then Reed glanced toward the office door, a small, nervous flick, before he said something else. Daniel had been meeting a man in an old green truck for a week straight. Always outside the lot. Always watching. My mind reached back to the last line of the note and something inside me tightened. I drove to the spot Reed mentioned. The ground was disturbed, deep boot prints heavier than Daniel's. A cigarette but lay half buried in the dirt, still warm enough that when I touched it I felt the faintest heat. Someone had been here. Someone waiting. Someone watching. The tracks leading from the trees matched the tire marks in my driveway. I drove home faster than I meant to, checking the mirror too often, half expecting a green truck to appear behind me. It didn't. But the house looked different when I pulled in. Too quiet, like the silence had thickened while I was gone. Just after dusk, a knock came at the door. It was slow. Polite. Almost gentle. Sheriff Willis stood on the porch, hat in hand, the fading light casting his shadow across my feet. He told me Daniel's truck had been found near the quarry, keys still in the ignition. My breath felt too thin then. The sheriff asked if Daniel left me anything. A message, a note, a sign he planned to go somewhere. My hand drifted to the letter hidden in my sweater pocket. For a moment I thought of giving it to him, but the words on the page felt too fragile to expose. Too dangerous. I lied and told him no. When he left, I locked the door twice. The workshop door at the back of the house had always been Daniel's space. He kept it locked, but tonight the lock clicked open too easily. Inside, the air was colder, touched with the faint metallic smell of tools left out too long. Maps were spread across his workbench. Circles drawn around parts of the woods. Dates written in small handwriting, some crossed out in thick strokes. There was a photograph too. Daniel standing with another man whose face turned just enough to hide itself. But his posture, straight, tense, pulled a thread of recognition inside me even though I couldn't name why. I slept little that night. At dawn, frost coated the yard. That was when I saw the footprints, deep, unfamiliar, leading from the edge of the woods to my back porch. They stopped beneath the kitchen window. The curtain was slightly open. Had I left it that way? I wasn't sure anymore. By afternoon, the light dimmed again. And then it came. The knock. Soft, careful, rhythmic enough to sound intentional. I didn't move. Not at first. The letter's last line echoed through me until it felt stitched to my ribs. The knock came again, followed by the slow exhale of someone standing close to the door. The doorknob trembled. Just slightly. Like a hand testing it. I stayed very still. Later, when the light finally died and the presence outside faded, I packed a small bag and followed the marks on the maps. The woods around the quarry felt older than the rest of town, tall pines leaning together like they were whispering overhead. I followed footpaths worn by deer and something else heavier. The ground in a small clearing looked disturbed. 2 sets of footprints, one dragging. A piece of Daniel's jacket lay half buried near the center. I knelt, touching it, trying to feel whatever story the dirt held. But the woods kept their silence. When I returned home, the house felt wrong again. Air too still, shadows too long. I sat at the table with the letter and let my fingers trace the final line. The pressure marks on the back caught my eye. I shaded gently with a pencil until faint letters rose like ghosts. He took my name. My breath broke. The warning wasn't about a stranger. It was about someone wearing the shape of my husband. The floor creaked behind me. Soft step. Then another. And the house stopped breathing again. I sat at the kitchen table long after the letter had fallen onto the wood with its quiet weight. My fingers hovered over the final line, tracing the letters as if I could feel the pulse of whoever had written them. The tremble in the ink wasn't something Daniel ever left behind. His hand was steady even when he was tired, even when the words were hurried or small. This wasn't his hand at all. I pushed the letter aside and opened a drawer I hadn't looked in for months. Inside were envelopes tied with faded ribbon, stacks of folded papers, the little letters Daniel had written when we first moved into the lake house. I pulled one out, unfolded it slowly, and felt the memory of those days fold back in around me. The smell of fresh pine in the morning, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath our boots, the way the sunlight used to settle across the table where we drank our first cups of coffee together. He had written each one with patience, pressing lightly, letting the pen settle on the page. Rounded loops, long curves, letters leaning with the ease of familiarity. I held the new letter beside them. The difference hit me before I even started reading. The first part of today's note, Daniel's part, belonged here. Gentle, precise, familiar. But the last line leaned at the wrong angle, jagged and hurried. The ink pressed unevenly into the paper, dents and grooves like someone had been watching the door while they wrote. I could feel it in my fingers. Fear, caution, a hand trembling just beneath the surface. I traced each letter slowly, letting the words burn into my mind. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. They weren't words Daniel would ever write, not like this, not with such urgency. And yet they were here on the same paper, in the same warmth that still lingered from his hand. Someone had been close enough to place their warning on top of his love, close enough to reach into our house, into the rhythm of our mornings. The kitchen felt colder than it had before. I hugged my arms to myself and looked around the room as if the walls might give me answers. They didn't. The curtains hung still, the sunlight weak through the glass. The hum of the refrigerator sounded sharper, more insistent, like it was reminding me of the absence that filled the spaces Daniel usually occupied. I went back to the letters from the early days. I lined them all out side by side, comparing loops, strokes, the tilt of his eyes, the curl at the ends of his T's. Every single one bore the same calm signature style. And then I placed the folded note on top. The last sentence felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The pressure too heavy in some places, too light in others. The letters were small, almost scared, each word compacted as though the hand writing it had been trembling with dread. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it like a thrum in my chest. I pressed the paper flat against the table, leaning closer, my nose near the surface. The smell of ink and paper mingled with the faint scent of Daniel's coffee cup from yesterday. I imagined the scene. Someone crouched over the table, maybe glancing at the hallway, maybe glancing at me in the next room if they'd been watching too long. The thought made my spine prickle. The silence of the house was heavier now, almost accusatory, as though it remembered someone moving through it without permission. I touched the indentations left on the page, running a fingertip slowly over the tiny impressions. Whoever had written this was careful in some ways, hurried in others. The hand had paused and pressed here, moved quickly there, a rhythm uneven, nervous, watching. I could feel the hesitation between words, the gaps that didn't belong. The message wasn't just in the ink. It was in the pauses, the spaces where the pen had lingered, where fear had etched itself into paper. I thought of the morning, Daniel leaving before sunrise. His boots thumped softly down the hallway, the familiar rhythm of routine. But that morning he had left faster, quieter, different. I remembered the subtle shift, how he lingered near the door for an extra moment, the way he adjusted the hem of his jacket as if he had something weighing him down that he couldn't explain. That same morning someone else had been here, close enough to write, to leave a warning. I shivered and pulled the letter closer again. My thumb pressed over the last line, tracing the letters slowly, desperately. Who had been close enough to touch our table? Who had watched Daniel leave? The thought made the kitchen feel smaller, the air thicker, each shadow stretching longer across the walls than it had before. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gravel driveway, the faint imprint of tire marks barely visible in the early fog. The world outside seemed softened by mist, muted and polite, the kind of morning that usually brought comfort. Today it offered nothing. I wanted to call out, to demand someone tell me what had happened, but the quiet kept my voice inside my chest. The house seemed to absorb the sound as if it didn't want anyone to know I was awake, watching, realizing. I went back to the letter, unfolding it carefully again, and held it against the light. The pressure marks stood out even more, shadows of words not visible in the ink. I traced them slowly, imagining a hand pressed into the paper while eyes darted to the door, waiting, watching, warning. Whoever had written this line had been afraid. Afraid of being caught. Afraid of something we didn't yet understand. That I sank into the chair, holding the note against my chest. The warmth was gone now, but the fear remained, seeping into the corners of the room, into the quiet spaces between the furniture, into my own heartbeat. It felt wrong that something could live in the house without our knowledge, leave its mark and disappear before we even realized. The kitchen floor creaked under my weight, the sound startling in the stillness. I held the note up again, scanning the last line for meaning, for clue, for the tiniest hint that it was part of Daniel, that it belonged to him. It didn't. And yet it was here, in the house we shared, carried in the hand of someone else who had been close enough to reach inside our life without permission. I pressed the paper flat, letting it rest between my palms. The sunlight had shifted across the table now, thin and pale. The air was colder. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the letter against my chest, and wondered how many mornings had passed where someone had been watching, waiting, knowing more than I did. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat, breathing slowly, letting the quiet settle, letting the weight of someone else's hand imprint itself into the rhythm of my life. Whoever it was, they had left a message. Whoever it was, they had entered our home and now they were gone. I didn't know if I would ever know their face. But I knew their handwriting. And it had changed everything. The fog lay heavy over the driveway, softening the edges of the world into gray shapes I couldn't quite name. I opened the front door and stepped onto the gravel, expecting Daniel's boots to crunch behind me. But there was nothing. Only the tire tracks pressed deeper than usual into the damp stone, like he'd left in a hurry, like he'd been running from something I couldn't see. The house felt smaller without him inside. Even the old maple tree in the yard seemed to lean away, holding its branches higher as if afraid to let the morning settle. My coat hung open, letting in the chill, and I pulled it tighter around me. The letter pressed against my side through the pocket of my sweater, its edges digging into my palm. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't stop myself. I squinted through the fog at the neighbor walking his dog. He waved, but his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, scanning my face like he was looking for something he didn't understand. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The dog sniffed at the damp gravel, unaware, and that made the stillness even more pronounced. My chest tightened, a small, sharp ache I couldn't shake. I tried calling Daniel. The ringtone cracked the fog, bouncing off the old fence posts, off the lake, off the morning itself. Straight to voicemail. I sank to the edge of the porch, clutching the letter tighter, feeling its weight settle into me. Its warmth from earlier had faded, leaving only the inked warning behind. I ran my fingers over the jagged letters again, remembering the tremble in the strokes, the hurried rhythm. Whoever wrote that line had been close, too close. And now Daniel was gone, leaving me with the echo of their presence. I wanted to believe it was a mistake. That it was a cruel prank, some story I would laugh about later with a cup of coffee and a shrug. But even as I told myself that, I could feel it. Something was off. The driveway, the tracks, the fog. The world itself felt shifted, unsteady, like the rhythm of it had broken just for me. The gravel shifted beneath my hands as I knelt, pressing my fingers into the grooves of the tire marks. They were deeper than any we'd ever had before. The edges crumbled slightly under my touch, damp with the fog and the memory of weight passing through them. I imagined Daniel behind the wheel, heart racing or maybe steady, pretending nothing was wrong, leaving in silence. And I imagined the other presence. The one who had touched the note, who had been close enough to warn me, watching him go. I stood slowly, shivering as a breeze passed through the yard, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke. My mind wandered back to the letter again. I could still feel the uneven pressure of the final line, the sharp tremble in the ink. Whoever had written it had been afraid. They had been careful. And they had been inside my home. I leaned against the porch railing and stared down the fogged road, trying to imagine the world from Daniel's perspective that morning. The empty spaces of the yard stretched ahead, a gray tunnel that seemed to swallow sound. I thought about how he had left without waking me, about how small moments could hide enormous secrets. Had he sensed the danger? Or had someone else moved faster than both of us could imagine? The wind shifted, rustling the leaves of the old maple tree. I heard a faint creak of the fence, a soft thump of gravel in the distance, and I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, quick and uneven. I wanted to call out, to ask for help, but the fog swallowed my voice before it even left my lips. I felt the letter pressing into my side again, and in it, a thread of connection to Daniel, and a thread of fear from someone I hadn't met. I stepped toward the road, following the path the tire marks suggested, letting the gravel crunch under my boots. Each step felt deliberate, heavy, measured. The fog wrapped around me, narrowing my world to nothing more than the tracks and the faint outlines of trees. I imagined a figure standing there, waiting, unseen. Someone who had been close enough to write the last line. Someone who had the power to change everything in a single stroke of a pen. I stopped halfway down the driveway, the letter trembling in my hands. I looked back at the house. The windows reflected the muted gray of the morning, and I thought I saw a shadow move inside, though I couldn't be sure. The thought made my chest tighten again. Whoever had been there might still be near. Maybe they were watching now, waiting for me to make a mistake. I dug my hands into the letter, feeling the indentations of the pen beneath the ink. My mind traced the lines again, imagining a hurried hand, glancing at the hallway, glancing at the front door. Someone had known our routines, had known the rhythm of our mornings, and had acted with quiet precision. And now Daniel was gone, leaving only the evidence of their presence. I closed my eyes and tried to recall the sound of his boots, the warmth of his touch as he kissed my forehead, the rhythm of his breathing in the bed beside me. The memory was faint, fragile, like a candle struggling against a draft. And in the fog, the driveway seemed longer, colder, emptier than it had ever been before. I opened my eyes to see the neighbor's dog sniffing closer, its nose brushing against the gravel, its tail flicking in nervous excitement. The neighbor watched silently from a distance, and I wondered if he knew something, if he had seen what I had not. I wanted to ask, to demand an answer, but the words stuck in my throat. Silence felt safer, though it pressed on me with a weight I could barely bear. I walked slowly back to the porch, the letter still clutched in my hands, feeling the weight of the morning pressing down. The fog lingered, softening every edge, hiding the details I needed to see. I sat again, letting the chill creep into my bones, and imagined Daniel driving down a road that was too gray, too empty, too silent. I imagined the other figure moving in parallel, unseen, untouchable, watching him, waiting. I pressed the letter to my chest once more and let my fingers follow the final line again. The words felt like ice against my skin. They were alive in a way, carrying a pulse I couldn't ignore. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. The warning had come too late for comfort, but just early enough to haunt the morning. I stayed on the porch for a long time, letting the fog press in on me, letting the silence weigh, letting the fear settle into the rhythm of my breath. I knew that somewhere in the gray of the morning, someone had been close enough to touch our lives and leave a mark. And I knew that whoever it was, they weren't finished. The driveway stretched ahead, empty and endless. I held the letter tighter. My boots dug into the gravel. And I whispered to myself, though no one could hear, "Who were you? And where is Daniel?" I drove the narrow road to the mill, the fog still clinging to the edges of the trees, wrapping the world in pale gray. The truck hummed quietly beneath me, the tires crunching softly on gravel I had come to know by memory. The closer I got to the mill, the heavier the air felt, like the world was pressing down just beyond the windshield. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and tried to breathe slowly, trying to tell myself that Daniel had simply gone ahead of his shift, nothing more, nothing less. The lot was nearly empty when I arrived, save for a few early arrivals and the scattered hum of machines in the distance. I stepped out of the truck, letting the chill bite through my coat. The smell of sawdust mixed with damp earth and gasoline filled my lungs. My eyes scanned the rows of trucks and equipment, searching for any sign of him, for a footprint, a jacket left behind, a trace of where Daniel had been. Reed's office was the only place that seemed to hold answers. I knocked lightly at the doorframe and he looked up, startled. His smile was thin, polite, but the tension behind his eyes gave him away. He didn't meet my gaze fully, glanced instead toward the office door like someone might be listening. His hands lingered on the desk, fiddling with a pen as if it were a lifeline. I told him I was looking for Daniel. I asked if he had seen him that morning. Reed hesitated, shifting on his feet, the floor creaking beneath him. The words didn't come right away. Finally, he said Daniel had left early, long before the end of his shift. Didn't sign out, didn't say goodbye to anyone. My chest tightened. That wasn't like him. He always signed out. He always left a note, even a small one. Reed's gaze flicked toward the door again. Then he lowered his voice. He said Daniel had been meeting a man outside the lot for the past week. Always the same man, he said, driving an old green truck. Always just outside the perimeter, always watching, never stepping inside. I felt my stomach tighten, the letter in my pocket suddenly pressing harder against my side. The words, the last line, crept back into my mind. Don't trust the man who knocks. The warning wasn't vague anymore. It had a face. It had a shape. Reed rubbed his hands together, a nervous motion I had seen before. He mentioned the timing, the way the meetings always happened before first light, before anyone else arrived. Daniel had been careful, he said, but not careful enough. Someone had noticed, and that someone had followed, had watched. I nodded slowly, letting the information sink in. Every part of the mill, every scent of sawdust and pine, every creak of the metal doors now felt sharper, more precise. I imagined Daniel standing in the early morning light, waiting for this man to appear in the green truck. I imagined the warning written in someone else's hand, pressed into paper on our kitchen table. I asked Reed if he knew the man's name. He shook his head. Only the truck, he said. Only the shape of it, the way it moved, the presence it carried. And still Reed's eyes were careful not to reveal more than he felt safe sharing. I wondered what he knew and why it had taken so long to speak it aloud. The weight of it pressed against me, and I let my hands rest on the office desk, feeling the rough grain of wood beneath my fingers. I imagined Daniel trusting someone, talking to someone he shouldn't have, moving too fast for the world to catch up. And I imagined the green truck idling quietly in the shadows, the engine warm, the figure inside watching the lot, watching my husband, waiting. I walked slowly across the gravel lot, scanning the edges where the shadows leaned long, trying to imagine the man who had made Daniel leave before dawn, the man who had forced a warning into my hands through the trembling hand of someone unknown. I felt the wind shift, carrying sawdust across my face, and I blinked against it, pressing my coat tighter. The world was wide, and yet, in that moment, it felt impossibly narrow, every sound amplified, every shadow meaningful. The line from the letter returned to me, vibrating like a quiet bell in my chest. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. Each repetition of it made the spaces between words heavier, more deliberate, sharper. I imagined Daniel reading it, imagining it, fearing it, writing it in his mind without knowing the final truth. I asked Reed again, softer this time, if Daniel seemed worried, if he had seemed different that week. Reed's answer was careful, guarded. He said Daniel had seemed distracted, often looking past the trees at the edge of the lot, glancing at the road that led out, the green truck appearing and disappearing like a shadow moving too fast for the eyes to catch. I nodded, letting it settle. The weight of the morning pressed on me, the fog clinging to the lot, the sound of machinery muted in the distance. I turned toward my truck, taking one last look at the shadows that seemed to shift at the corners of my vision. Someone had been close enough to touch my husband's life, to leave traces of fear and instruction. Someone had shaped the day, made decisions without our consent. I drove away slowly, leaving the gravel lot behind. The sun was climbing, but the light seemed weak, strained through the haze. I held the letter in my lap, feeling its tremble as if it were alive. My mind wandered to the green truck, to the man inside it, to Daniel standing there somewhere, unaware of the warning pressed into paper at our table. The road stretched ahead, empty, soft with mist, and I felt the fog pressing in from the sides, narrowing the world, hiding the truths I needed to see. I wondered where Daniel had gone, what he had said, what he had left unsaid. And I wondered how long it would be before the man in the green truck returned, or before the warning I carried finally made sense. The letter rested against my thigh, its last line folded into memory now, a pulse I could feel in my chest. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. I whispered it softly, letting it echo through the truck cab, letting it mark the morning with the weight of someone else's presence, someone we hadn't met yet, someone who had forced our hands and hearts into motion before we even knew the danger existed. The mill receded behind me, the fog swallowing it into nothing. And still the warning remained, sharp and precise, stitched into my thoughts, pressing against the rhythm of my life in ways I couldn't yet untangle. Whoever had been close enough to warn me, or to touch Daniel, was out there, and the world had tilted beneath their presence. I didn't know how much longer it would hold before it broke entirely. I found the spot Reed had mentioned, a patch of dirt just beyond the edge of the mill lot, where the trees leaned close as though listening. The ground was soft from the morning fog, and I could see the imprint of heavy boots pressed deep into the soil. They weren't Daniel's. His steps were lighter, careful, deliberate. These were different, heavier, impatient, a sense of purpose behind each press of foot to earth. I knelt, brushing the dirt away with my fingers, feeling the small depressions as if I could read a story written in soil. A cigarette but lay nearby, crushed just enough to know someone had been impatient, someone who had lit it to pass the weight, then tossed it aside. Heat lingered faintly, a reminder that this was recent. I could almost feel the presence of the man who had been there, lingering in the mist and the silence, watching. The trees seemed older here, their trunks gnarled, their roots pressing up through the dirt like fingers. I imagined a figure in the green truck, sitting, waiting, engine humming softly. The hum of the engine was imagined, yes, but the tension it carried was real, pressing down on me even from a distance. I pictured Daniel moving toward him, wary but trusting, unaware of what the note at our kitchen table had truly meant. I followed the tracks from the dirt patch, tracing them toward the edge of the road. Tire impressions were faint but clear, identical to those I had seen this morning in our driveway. My heart thumped, loud and uneven, as I realized that the stranger who had been close enough to leave a warning in our house had followed Daniel here. Had been close enough to touch the edges of our lives and vanish without a trace. The forest pressed in from both sides, branches brushing against my coat as I walked slowly along the road, each step deliberate, careful. The damp smell of pine filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of exhaust from earlier. I imagined the man stepping out of the green truck, scanning the lot, watching Daniel, waiting for the exact moment to strike or to warn or to vanish. The thought made my stomach knot, made the letter in my pocket burn hotter against my side. I stopped and looked back toward the mill. Gray shapes moved slowly through the fog, the edges of the buildings softened, familiar yet distorted. I tried to imagine Daniel, unaware of the danger, moving through the same shapes, trusting, unaware of the presence waiting for him. I felt the air grow colder, the fog thickening, pressing against my skin. The world was silent in the way that made me aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every movement I couldn't see. I crouched again near the tracks, letting my fingers brush over the tire marks. The edges were sharp where the vehicle had turned too fast, the dirt kicked up like warning flags. Someone had been impatient. Someone had been in a hurry. The thought made my hands shake slightly, and I pressed the letter deeper into my coat pocket, grounding myself with its weight. I imagined the stranger's movements. Stepping out of the cab, boots sinking into the soft dirt, hand gliding over the hood of the truck, glancing toward the lot, toward Daniel, toward the trees lining the road. I felt it in my chest, the same pulse I had felt in the kitchen when I traced the last line of the letter. The presence was deliberate, precise, aware of boundaries and how to skirt them. The tracks led off the dirt patch toward the main road, toward the world beyond the mill, beyond the forest. I followed slowly, letting the crunch of gravel beneath my boots anchor me in the present. I imagined Daniel's hands, his expression, his uncertainty. The way he might have paused, turned his head and seen nothing. He didn't know. None of it made sense yet. And I could feel the stranger still, unseen, shaping the day around him like a shadow in motion. I crouched one last time, scanning the ground. Leaves stuck to the soft impressions, flattened in the movement, and a single pine needle lay across the deepest track. It felt deliberate, like a marker, a reminder that someone had been here, and now I was seeing the traces they left behind. I pressed my palm into the dirt, feeling the texture, imagining the weight of the boots that had been here minutes, maybe hours before. The fog thickened, pressing against my face, muffling sound, softening edges. The trees seemed alive, bending subtly toward me, listening to my breathing, my movements, the slow, deliberate steps that mirrored those of the stranger. I shivered, feeling exposed, feeling the letter burn against my chest, its final line pressing itself into memory. I rose slowly, scanning the horizon, imagining the green truck parked somewhere in the haze, idling silently, waiting. The morning had begun quietly, but now the world felt hollow, stretched thin across the edge of fear. I could sense the danger without seeing it, could feel the presence without names, could hear the silence speak louder than any voice could. I walked back toward my truck, following the tracks that led away, letting the imprint of each step stay in my mind. The forest watched me, the fog pressed in from all sides, and the letter rested against my chest like a pulse I could feel with every movement. Whoever had been here had left a story written in dirt and cigarette ash and faint tire impressions, and I was reading it like a map without a key. The road ahead stretched empty, quiet, gray. I climbed into the truck and let the engine rumble beneath me, letting the vibrations anchor me, letting the letter press against my heart. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I drove away slowly, leaving the green truck's ghost behind in the morning mist. The letter burned hotter against my side as I imagined Daniel standing somewhere in the gray light, waiting for someone, trusting someone, unaware of the warning pressed in trembling ink onto the paper I now carried. And I realized more clearly than before that the stranger who had written those words, who had left those tracks, who had watched and waited, was closer than we could imagine. Every step, every trace, every mark left in dirt or ink felt deliberate, meant to guide me, warn me, or trap me. And I held the letter tighter, tracing its jagged line again with a trembling fingertip. The green truck, the man in it, the warning, it all pressed against my mind like fog clinging to the trees. I didn't know which way the day would lead, but I knew one thing. Someone had moved faster than both of us. Someone had been there. And someone had been waiting. The forest faded behind me, the morning light struggling through the fog, but the warning remained, sharp and deliberate, pressing into the rhythm of my heart. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. The knock came just after dusk, soft and deliberate, a rhythm that seemed to echo in the quiet of the house. I froze, feeling the letter in my sweater press into my ribs. The warmth from my earlier reading long faded. The sound carried across the porch, bouncing off the siding and settling in my chest. I held my breath, waiting, listening, imagining. I opened the door to Sheriff Willis standing there, tall, with a shadow stretching across the porch in the fading light. His eyes were calm, but I could see the weight of the day in them, the practiced patience of someone used to carrying news that didn't belong to him. He didn't smile. Didn't speak right away. Just let the silence settle between us. The air smelled faintly of rain and pine. He said Daniel's truck had been found near the old quarry. Keys still in the ignition. Nothing else. My stomach knotted. The words barely made sense. I could feel the house lean in around me, the walls pressing closer, listening. I gripped the doorframe, feeling the rough wood under my palm, trying to ground myself in something real. He asked if Daniel had left anything behind, any sign, any note, any explanation. My fingers brushed the letter hidden beneath my sweater, over my heart, and I hesitated. I wanted to tell him everything, but something inside warned me to hold back. The fear in that final line, "Don't trust the man who knocks," thrummed through me, a pulse of warning I couldn't ignore. I shook my head softly. The sheriff's gaze lingered, assessing, careful. He asked again, more gently this time, if I had seen anyone, anything unusual, anyone near the house that morning. I said no, and it was the closest thing to a lie I could manage. Not exactly untrue. I hadn't seen anyone. But I had felt someone there. Someone who had touched our lives, moved through our home, and left a warning inked in trembling letters. Sheriff Willis nodded slowly, as though he understood more than I was willing to say. He glanced down at the gravel driveway, still damp from the morning fog, and then back at me. "We'll keep looking," he said. "I'll have deputies check the roads, the area around the mill, the quarry. If he left any sign, we'll find it." The words should have comforted me, but instead they felt like the weight of waiting, the heaviness of uncertainty pressing in. I felt the letter burn against my chest, its final line a pulse I could feel in my bones. "Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks." I traced the words with my fingertips under my sweater, the uneven pressure of the ink a reminder of the person who had been here before the sheriff, before the daylight, before I even knew. He asked if Daniel had been acting differently, if I had noticed tension, fear, anything unusual. I thought about the week past, the way he had come home tired, distracted, sometimes staring toward the trees as if seeing something I could not. I said nothing. Words would have revealed too much too soon. The sheriff would not have understood the tremble in the ink, the warning left by someone I didn't yet know. The wind shifted, and I felt the chill move through the house, curling around the corners of the kitchen where the letter had been left. The windows rattled softly, a faint echo of presence. My heart skipped a beat. The sheriff glanced toward the sound, alert but calm, trained to notice things without naming them. I did not speak, and neither did he. Silence carried enough weight. He told me he would check in again in the morning, leaving the faint scent of leather and the quiet authority of someone who carried responsibility like armor. I nodded, pressing the letter tighter beneath my sweater. The world outside had faded to gray, and inside the shadows had lengthened, the weight of the unknown pressing against the walls, pressing against my chest. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me in the dim light of the hallway. I could feel the emptiness of the house, the absence of Daniel, the quiet reminder of the letter. I walked slowly to the kitchen, letting my fingers trace the edge of the table where it had been placed, imagining the hand that had left it there, the fear in the ink, the warning carried into my life without explanation. I poured a cup of tea, letting the steam rise in thin curls, trying to draw warmth into myself where there was none. The mug was hot in my hands, a small comfort, but it could not mask the echo of the morning, the tracks, the green truck, the tremble in the ink. I sipped slowly, listening to the quiet house, imagining the sheriff driving away down the gray road, thinking he had done his part, unaware of the full weight of what the final line meant. The evening deepened, shadows stretching across the walls, the faint hum of the refrigerator like a heartbeat in the background. I held the letter against my chest again, feeling the jagged line press through layers of paper and memory. Someone had been here, someone had warned me, someone had made a mark I could feel but could not yet trace fully. I walked past the window, staring out at the darkened yard, imagining the green truck hidden in the trees, its presence folded into the night. Whoever had left that warning had been careful, deliberate, precise. And now Daniel was gone, leaving only the echo of their presence and the tremble in ink pressed onto a sheet of paper that felt heavier than any weight I had carried before. I sat at the table, letting the steam of my tea curl around my hands. The letter rested beside me, edges curled slightly from the heat. I traced the words with my finger, slower this time, letting the tremor in the ink guide my thoughts. The sheriff had left with reassurance, but reassurance was fragile. It could not explain the pulse I felt in my chest, the way the shadows clung to corners, the way the world seemed smaller, tighter, and waiting. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint rustle of leaves, and I thought I heard something more, a soft, deliberate shuffle across the gravel, almost like footsteps. My hand tightened on the letter, pressing it against my heart. The final line echoed again, sharp, insistent. "Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks." I whispered it aloud, softly, letting it fill the kitchen, let it press into the walls, let it settle into the evening like a warning carved into the air itself. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, staring into the dark, tracing every shadow, imagining every figure moving just beyond the trees. The letter pressed against my chest, warm and heavy, a small heartbeat in the silence. I knew the world had shifted, that someone had moved faster than both of us, that the night carried more than darkness, and that the final line was still waiting, deliberate and precise, for the next step, for the next moment for me. The house felt heavier when I turned toward the back room, Daniel's workshop. The door was closed, as it always was, the lock a small barrier between the ordinary world and the one he kept hidden. I paused at the handle, my fingers brushing the cold metal, feeling the weight of the key in my pocket. It was mine now, or at least it would be, if I dared. I slid the key into the lock slowly, hearing it click, a small sound, but it felt enormous. The hinges groaned faintly as the door opened, revealing the familiar clutter. Sawdust on the floor, shelves lined with tools, the faint smell of oil and pine lingering in the air. But tonight it was different. Tonight, every shadow seemed sharper, every object more deliberate, like the room itself had been waiting for me to see it. Maps were pinned to the wall, yellowed edges curling. Dates in small circles were drawn in ink, some crossed out, some circled again. I traced a finger along the lines, imagining Daniel standing here, plotting, thinking, tracking. There were layers of thought in the markings. Reminders, warnings, perhaps a map of intentions I wasn't meant to see yet. My breath caught as I realized how precise, how methodical it all was. I opened drawers carefully, running my fingers over scattered papers, notebooks filled with neat handwriting. And then I found it, a photograph tucked inside the top drawer. Daniel was there, smiling faintly, standing beside another man. The man's face was half turned away, obscured, but the posture, the stance, something about him felt familiar, though I couldn't place it. I held the photo in my hands, the paper cool, edges rough. I felt the weight of history pressing through it, a quiet presence that made the room hum softly. On the workbench there were tools laid out in neat rows, small scraps of wood, half-finished projects. But my eyes kept returning to the maps, the circles, the photograph. I imagined Daniel moving through the woods he had mapped, his steps deliberate, tracing paths that no one else might know. I imagined the man in the photograph moving beside him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unsaid between them, some tension that had been carried in silence. The room smelled of sawdust and oil, but there was another scent, faint and metallic, almost like iron. It pressed against me, subtle, insistent, as though the room remembered something I did not. I leaned against the workbench, letting my hands rest on its rough surface, feeling the hum of the air, the quiet echo of voices that had never spoken aloud. Every small sound, a tap of a tool, a drawer sliding, the floorboards creaking, seemed amplified, like the room itself was breathing. I noticed small notes pinned around the maps, folded pieces of paper with dates and initials. I unfolded one carefully, tracing the neat writing, imagining Daniel's hand moving across the page. And then I saw it. A mark, scribbled in thick ink, almost an afterthought, a correction. The letters trembled slightly. My chest tightened. It was deliberate, urgent. Someone had been watching, noting, marking things that were important, things I might not understand yet. The photograph slipped slightly in my hands and I pressed it back into the drawer. The man's face, still half-turned, seemed to follow me, the angle of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, all whispering some secret I wasn't yet ready to hear. I imagined Daniel explaining nothing, leaving the circles, the dates, the warnings unspoken, carrying them silently like a burden too heavy to share. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight as I moved closer to the maps, tracing paths that led to the quarry, to the trees, to the empty spaces between known things. I imagined footsteps, heavier than Daniel's, crossing the paths he had drawn, intruding, watching, moving without acknowledgement. A chill ran through me, the letter in my pocket suddenly warmer, heavier. The final line pressed against my chest again, insistent. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. I ran my fingers over the edges of the maps, feeling the paper crinkle slightly under my touch. I imagined Daniel standing here, alone or with the man in the photograph, planning, tracking, anticipating. And I realized the room itself held the memory of these movements, the echoes of conversations that had never been spoken, the quiet hum of plans unfolding. The window at the back of the workshop was open slightly, letting in a draft that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The light outside was fading fast, gray shifting to deep blue. Shadows leaned into corners, stretching across the maps, across the floor, across my hands. I could feel the room watching me as much as I was watching it, every tool, every scrap of paper, every faint mark carrying a message. I closed the drawers slowly, running my hands along the edges, feeling the grain of the wood, the roughness, the weight of things left behind. I imagined Daniel's footsteps, echoing through the workshop as he moved between the shelves and the workbench, the maps and the photograph. I imagined his hands tracing the lines, his eyes scanning for patterns, for danger, for the presence I had not yet seen. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing slowly, feeling the chill press through my sweater, the letter burning against my side. The workshop hummed softly, the faint creak of the floor, the whisper of the draft, the smell of sawdust and oil and faint iron. And I understood finally that Daniel had been moving in a world I barely glimpsed, one marked by maps and circles, by careful steps and hidden warnings. I left the photograph in the drawer, carefully, deliberately, letting it remain a mystery, a question waiting for an answer. I traced the edges of the maps one last time, imagining footsteps, the green truck, the letter, the warning. And as I turned to leave, I felt the workshop exhale, the shadows settling back into corners, the air vibrating with the quiet memory of plans and people and movements unseen. The door clicked softly behind me, leaving the room still and alive with everything I hadn't yet understood. I held the letter to my chest again, feeling its pulse, knowing that Daniel's absence was not just from the house but from a world I had only begun to see. And I realized that the maps, the photographs, the workshop, they were more than paper and wood. They were a record of something urgent, deliberate, and dangerous. I woke to frost clinging to the edges of the porch, tiny crystals catching the early light like forgotten promises. The air was still, quiet except for the faint rustle of the trees, and for a moment I thought the world had paused. I stepped carefully onto the back porch, my slippers crunching softly against the cold wood. That's when I saw them, footprints pressed into the thin layer of frost, faint but deliberate, leading from the tree line to the edge of the house. I knelt, tracing the indentations with my gloved fingers. They were larger than Daniel's, heavier, more forceful. The frost hadn't completely frozen over, so the impression was crisp, telling a story I didn't want to read. Each step seemed calculated, each stop deliberate. They ended beneath the kitchen window, where the curtains always hung slightly askew. I imagined someone standing there just beyond the glass, watching while I slept, unseen, unnoticed. My chest tightened, the letter in my pocket suddenly heavier, almost burning. I pressed my hand over it, feeling the rough edge of paper, the familiar weight of Daniel's words, and the stranger's warning, against my palm. I could almost hear the whisper of ink, faint but insistent. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. The words pressed into me with a new, sharper meaning now, as though they were alive, moving with the footsteps frozen in frost. I followed the tracks along the porch, careful not to disturb them, imagining the stranger's movements, boots pressing into the cold, each step a measure of control, of intent. I imagined him pausing at the window, tilting his head just so, listening, watching, waiting. I felt the cold prickling up my spine, a physical echo of the unease I carried in my chest since the letter appeared. The house felt different in that light, quieter, more deliberate. Shadows clung to corners, pooling along the edges of walls and windows, moving slowly as the sun shifted behind the trees. Every sound, my breath, the scrape of my glove, the faint creak of the porch, felt amplified as if the frost itself were listening. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in the hollow space between floors. I traced the steps back toward the tree line, trying to imagine the person who had moved so carefully through my yard, who had crossed the threshold of ordinary life and left a story written in frost. The tracks were too precise to be random. Someone had been here, someone had chosen their path, and someone had stopped just beneath my window to see what they wanted. I pressed my hand to the glass, imagining the weight of their gaze, the subtle pause of observation, the quiet patience of a presence hidden in plain sight. The wind shifted, carrying a faint rustle of leaves, a whisper across the frost. My lips moved silently, repeating the warning in the letter over and over. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. The final line pressed against me now with new urgency. Whoever had written it, whoever had left those footsteps, had been closer than I realized, more deliberate, more calculating. And Daniel, where was he in all this? I crouched near the porch steps, examining the tracks again, imagining the boots moving carefully back toward the tree line. I traced the deep impressions with my finger, feeling the cold frost press into my skin. They led outward, away from the house, back into the edge of the woods, disappearing into the gray morning mist. I imagined the man watching from there, waiting for something, or someone, to appear. The morning light grew stronger, revealing the edges of frost on the trees, the quiet sway of branches, the dusting of snow that hadn't yet melted. Everything seemed still, but I knew it wasn't. The tracks were a record, a reminder of presence, of intrusion, of intent. And the final line of the letter, the one that didn't belong to Daniel, seemed alive, echoing in every movement I imagined, in every shadow stretching across the frost. I stood slowly, letting the cold seep through my coat, my gloves, my skin. I looked toward the tree line, toward the point where the tracks vanished into the morning gray. I could almost see the figure there, hidden, watching, silent, waiting. The thought pressed into me like ice, like a hand on my shoulder, and I pressed the letter tighter against my chest, feeling its warmth against the chill of the morning. I thought of Daniel moving through the day, unaware of the steps traced through frost, unaware of the presence that had been so close. I imagined him trusting, unaware, as I had once trusted him, as I had trusted the world outside the windows of our home. And I felt the weight of the unknown pressing in, the quiet ache of fear that was patient, deliberate, waiting for a moment to be acknowledged. I returned to the porch, standing just inside the door now, letting the shadows of the morning stretch across the floor. I could hear faint sounds, birds stirring, wind brushing the frost, the subtle hum of life continuing despite what had been left behind. But in the quiet I could still feel the footsteps, the intent in the impressions, the weight of someone moving deliberately through my life. I pressed my hand against the table where the letter had first appeared, feeling the texture of paper under my fingertips, the uneven pressure of the ink still faintly there. "Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks." I whispered it aloud, letting the words fill the empty house, tracing the edges of shadows, pressing into corners. The footsteps had stopped, but their story lingered, pressing against my chest, pressing against the walls, pressing against the rhythm of the morning itself. I didn't move for a long time, standing in the quiet, feeling the frost under my feet, imagining the figure in the trees, imagining the boots pressing into soil and frost, imagining the deliberate pause beneath the window. The world outside seemed ordinary, gray and still, but I knew it wasn't. It was deliberate. It was waiting. It was patient. The letter burned against my side again, final line pressing into me, insistent. The warning. And I realized that whoever had left those tracks, whoever had written that sentence, was not gone. They were here, in the edges of the yard, in the spaces between frost and shadow, in the quiet that the world pretended didn't exist. And I knew that the next step, what I would do, what I would see, would have to be careful, deliberate, like footsteps pressed into frost before the world wakes. The knock came late in the afternoon, soft, almost polite, but it carried a weight that pressed the air out of the room. I froze, hand hovering over the edge of the kitchen table, the letter still pressed against my side like a heartbeat. The sound echoed faintly against the walls, bouncing once, twice, settling into the quiet corners where shadows pooled. I counted the seconds in the silence, feeling each one stretch, fragile, deliberate. I didn't move. I couldn't. The words from the letter whispered in my mind, "Don't trust the man who knocks." I had read them again and again, traced the uneven indentations left in the paper, felt the tremor of someone else's hand pressing the warning into my life. And now the sound pressed against the door, insistent but soft, deliberate, like a pulse I couldn't ignore. The room smelled faintly of dust and fading sunlight, the curtains drawn but swaying slightly as the wind whispered through the edges of the windows. I could hear my own breath, slow, uneven, as though I were trying not to announce my presence. The kitchen clock ticked, a steady rhythm that seemed too loud against the pause outside. The knock came again, softer this time, deliberate, measured. Someone was there. Someone who knew. I moved closer to the door, shifting my weight on the floorboards. Each step creaked faintly, a warning to the quiet house, a tremor in the calm. I could see the faint outline of the doorknob trembling under the soft knock. My hand hovered near it, hesitant, wanting to retreat and wanting to confront at the same time. My mind traced the words in the letter, the warning pressed into my chest. Not just about a stranger, but about a presence that was close, precise, calculated. The knock came again, slower this time, deliberate, like someone testing patience, waiting for recognition. I pressed my forehead against the door, feeling the chill of the wood, feeling the vibrations from the hand on the other side. My heart thumped in my ears, a rhythm that echoed the uneven strokes in the final line of the letter. I imagined the person standing there, quiet, patient, watching, waiting for me to understand the warning. I stepped back slightly, letting the shadows from the room stretch long across the floor. The wind shifted and the curtains fluttered, brushing against the sill, carrying with them the scent of damp earth, of pine, of something faintly metallic that made my stomach twist. I imagined the figure beyond the door, tall, still, patient, the words from the letter a silent pulse between us. Thought about Daniel. About his absence, the abandoned truck, the maps, the hidden photographs, the circles in the woods. About the letter and the tremor in the ink, the uneven pressure of a hand that was not his. And I realized that the warning was not just for him, not just for me. It was for us both, a thread tying the present to a presence that had been moving through our lives long before the knock. The knocking came again, slow, measured, insistent but polite. I imagined the hand, the weight, the intent pressing through the wood, pressing into the house, pressing into the air. I wanted to speak, to say something, to demand, to ask. But the words caught in my throat. The silence answered instead, thick, waiting, alive. I pressed my ear to the door, listening to the slow exhale of someone breathing on the other side. The rhythm was deliberate, controlled, patient. I imagined their eyes, unseen but certain, trained on the movements inside, noting the slightest tremor, the faintest shift. I felt a cold shiver run up my spine. I traced the letter in my pocket with my fingers, feeling the edges press into my palm, the uneven line pressing into my chest, the warning alive with urgency. I thought of the footsteps in the frost, the green truck, the abandoned quarry, the maps, the hidden photographs. I thought of all the moments before this, the quiet signals, the subtle signs that something was moving, unseen, deliberate. And now the knock pressed into the room, into me, into the spaces between heartbeats and shadows, demanding recognition. I stood perfectly still, imagining the man beyond the door, imagining his patience, his awareness, his control. I imagined him listening, moving just enough, testing, measuring, waiting. I felt the weight of the unknown pressing against me, and I held the letter tighter, feeling the warmth and the warning and the tremor of someone else's hand, alive across time and paper. The knocking came again, gentle, deliberate, and I realized it wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a presence, patient, quiet, insistent, pressing against the threshold of my life. I pressed my hand to the doorknob, feeling the tremor beneath my fingers, the slow exhale of the person beyond, and I understood that the moment demanded a choice: to stay silent, to wait, or to confront the presence waiting just beyond the wood. I stepped back from the door, letting the shadows swallow me, letting the quiet press against my chest, letting the letter burn against my side. The knock had stopped for a moment, leaving a hollow echo, the soft residue of presence lingering in the air, the kind of silence that holds weight, that carries memory, that whispers warning. I whispered the words from the letter, softly, as if saying them aloud might anchor me to reality. Don't follow me. Don't trust the man who knocks. The silence answered, thick and heavy, a reminder that someone was there just beyond the door, deliberate, patient, watching. I could feel it in the floorboards, the walls, the shadows, the air. I did not open the door. I did not retreat either. I simply stood, listening, breathing, feeling the letter pulse against my side like a warning heartbeat. The world outside seemed ordinary, the late afternoon sun painting long shadows across the yard, but inside the house held the presence, deliberate, insistent, patient. I waited. And in the quiet, I understood that this was no longer just about Daniel. No longer just about a stranger. It was about presence, intention, and the careful, deliberate steps someone had taken to enter our lives. And I knew that the knock was only the beginning. The door creaked faintly behind me, almost like a reminder, and I pressed my hand again against the letter, feeling the tremor in the ink, the final line insistent in my chest. The warning alive, waiting, deliberate. The map Daniel left trembled slightly in my hands, its paper worn, edges frayed from being unfolded and folded again. I traced the small circles he had drawn near the quarry, imagining the paths he had taken, the places he had paused. The morning air pressed against my face, crisp and sharp, smelling of wet earth and pine. Every step into the woods felt like stepping into a memory, thick and heavy, layered with the quiet tension of what I didn't yet know. The trees leaned close, old and wise, their branches brushing against each other, whispering in a language I could almost understand. The light was gray, filtered through the canopy, turning the forest into a soft, muted film. My boots pressed into damp soil, leaves crunching faintly beneath them. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to uncover something I wasn't meant to see. I followed the path Daniel had marked, circles intersecting, lines crossing between them, as though he were drawing not just maps but warnings. The underbrush caught at my coat sleeves, snagged my hair, whispered against my skin. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, was amplified, deliberate, a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I imagined Daniel walking these same steps, boots pressing into mud, eyes scanning, cautious, measured. The first clearing appeared suddenly, sunlight breaking through the trees in a single jagged shaft. The earth was disturbed, churned as if someone had struggled there. 2 sets of footprints pressed into the soil. One firm, purposeful, the other dragging, uneven, telling of a body moved against its will. I crouched near them, feeling the cold seep into my gloves, the weight of realization pressing down. Someone had been here. Something had happened. I found a scrap of torn fabric in the center of the clearing, twisted and damp. My fingers brushed it and I recognized the texture immediately. Daniel's jacket, the one he always wore when he left early. A shiver ran through me and I pulled the scrap closer, imagining the struggle, imagining the hands, the force, the silent panic that must have passed through this place. The forest was quiet now, but the stillness carried a memory too heavy to ignore. I traced the circles on the map again, comparing them to the clearing, trying to piece together the sequence, the movements. The earth told a story Daniel hadn't written. Hesitation, conflict, pursuit, presence. I could feel his steps alongside the intruders, measured, precise, deliberate, leaving behind not just footprints but questions pressed into soil and shadow. The wind shifted, brushing against the trees, carrying the faint scent of metal and pine. I imagined the intruder standing nearby, hidden, patient, observing. The thought made my chest tighten, a low ache that spread to my fingers and toes. I pressed my gloved hands together, feeling the fabric of my coat, the letters in my pocket, the warmth and warning pressed against my side. I crouched near the edge of the clearing, listening to the hollow silence. The forest had no sound beyond the rustle of leaves and the faint cry of a bird overhead, but I could feel the echo of struggle in the soil, the drag of fabric against earth, the invisible rhythm of someone moving unseen. The circles on the map felt alive now, not just markers but signals, warnings, coordinates in a story I hadn't yet fully grasped. I moved cautiously, following the faint signs outward, imagining Daniel's steps, imagining the other presence, the one who had forced his movement, traced his path, left whispers of warning behind. I thought about the letter, about the final line, about the uneven ink pressed into paper. And suddenly it all pressed into place. The warning wasn't only for me. It wasn't only about the man who knocks. It was about something, or someone, who had walked these woods alongside Daniel, quietly, deliberately, hiding in plain sight. The forest closed around me as I moved closer to the quarry, the air growing colder, heavier. Shadows pooled in the hollows of the trees, stretching long as the light fell. I imagined 2 bodies, one resisting, one forcing, the rhythm of struggle pressed into mud and frost and stone. My breath came in shallow, measured gasps, but I forced myself to keep moving, following the map, following the memory of footsteps and circles, following the truth that Daniel had left behind. The edge of the quarry appeared, gray stone cutting into the earth, silent and unyielding. The disturbed soil led right to the brink and I peered down, feeling the vertigo of distance, the hollow ache of absence. The fabric scrap trembled in my hand, a reminder that the struggle had happened here, close to the edge, intimate and deliberate. My stomach twisted as I imagined Daniel, moved, forced, but still present, leaving traces for me to follow, a breadcrumb trail in the world he had once known. I turned slowly in the clearing, scanning every shadow, every tree, every patch of earth, trying to see the signs I might have missed. The footprints faded, but the story remained, pressed into the ground, insistent, demanding recognition. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling the uneven final line like a pulse, like a heartbeat carrying a secret across distance and time. The silence was so complete it felt wrong, heavy, alive. I crouched again, pressing my palm against the disturbed soil, imagining Daniel's hands there, imagining his presence, imagining the careful, deliberate rhythm that had guided him, that had left traces for me to follow. The forest seemed to lean closer, old trees creaking, branches brushing, whispering secrets I couldn't yet fully understand. I stood slowly, letting the forest breathe around me, letting the light fall across the clearing, across the footprints, across the scrap of fabric in my hand. I realized that the truth of this place was not simple, not linear. It was layered, hidden, deliberate, and carried in steps and shadows and scraps and warnings pressed into paper. I traced the final circle on the map with my finger, imagining Daniel's movements, imagining the intruder, imagining the struggle that had left these signs behind. I felt the letter burn against my side again, its final line pressing into me, the warning alive, insistent. And I understood finally that the story of this clearing was not over, that the presence pressing into these woods was patient, deliberate, still out there, waiting. I left the clearing slowly, every step careful, measured, imagining the footsteps fading behind me, retracing Daniel's, leaving the story alive in the soil, in the frost, in the trees. The quarry loomed behind me, silent and gray, holding its memory. And I knew that what I had seen, the footprints, the fabric, the earth itself, was only part of the warning, only part of the truth that would follow me back to the house, back to the letter, back to the final line that Daniel had left pressed into my life. I returned home with the forest pressing behind me, the weight of the clearing lingering in every step. The trees, the frost, the disturbed earth, they were all alive in my mind, pulling at the edges of memory, tugging at the uneven rhythm of my heartbeat. The house greeted me like a familiar ghost, silent, patient, as if it had waited all day for me to step back inside. I hung my coat, letting the cold brush against the back of my neck, and felt the letter in my pocket, heavy, insistent, warning me of truths I had only begun to understand. I sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight slanting across the surface, highlighting every crease in the paper, every indentation pressed into the fibers. I ran my fingers over the familiar lines Daniel had written, tracing the letters as if I could feel his presence through the ink. Apologies for late shifts, reminders to eat, quiet reassurances of love. All steady, familiar, almost comforting. And then my fingers found the final line, the one that didn't belong. My breath caught, a low gasp I tried to swallow back. The letters were narrow, shaky, the ink pressed unevenly into the page as though written in haste and fear. I shaded the paper with my pencil over and over, light and soft, tracing the faint impressions left behind. The words slowly emerged, pressed into the sheet by the hand that had written atop another, leaving only faint indentations for me to discover. He took my name. The letters appeared like a ghost emerging from the paper, delicate, insistent, undeniable. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted the pencil, staring at the words. Daniel hadn't written this. He had left me a warning, a message hidden in plain sight, layered in ink and pressure and intention. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling the warmth of his hand from the original writing and the chill of someone else's presence pressed into that final line. My mind traced the footsteps in the frost, the green truck, the clearing in the woods, the disturbed soil, the scrap of fabric. It all pressed together now, a quiet revelation I could feel in the hollow of my chest. Daniel hadn't been warning me about a stranger in the woods. He had been warning me about someone who had taken his name, someone who could slip into our lives unnoticed, someone who had been patient, deliberate, and hidden from view. The air in the house shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold stone, memories of footsteps and frost, of fabric dragged through soil and over leaves. The walls seemed to lean closer, listening, remembering. Shadows stretched across the floor, long and deliberate as if they too carried the warning. I could feel a presence in the room now, careful, patient, deliberate, moving just beyond my perception. The door creaked behind me, faint, almost imperceptible, and I froze, feeling the weight of it settle into my bones. I didn't move. I could hear the slow inhale and exhale of someone standing just beyond the threshold. My eyes darted toward the shadows that clung to the corners of the kitchen, imagining the figure there, waiting, deliberate, patient. Every muscle in me pressed against instinct, a quiet tension that refused to break. I traced the uneven final line in my mind again, whispering it aloud. He took my name. The words pressed into me, insistent, alive, and I realized the truth. The person who had written that line was not just in the past, not just in the letter. They were here, in the room, in the house, in the quiet that pressed against my skin. I thought of Daniel, of his careful maps, his circles, his warnings, his absence. I thought of the footprints in frost, the disturbed soil in the clearing, the scrap of fabric. And now I understood fully. He had tried to warn me, to prepare me, to leave me a trail of quiet signs that could survive even if he couldn't. But the warning was incomplete, fragile, hidden in subtle indentations in the spaces between letters. And the presence behind the door, patient, deliberate, hidden, was the last piece of the puzzle I hadn't yet faced. The letter burned against my chest again, its edges rough, pressing into my ribs, a physical echo of the fear and urgency Daniel had left behind. I slid it slowly from my pocket and placed it on the table, tracing the final line again, letting my finger brush over each indentation, feeling the faint tremor of the unknown hand. Whoever had written it had been precise, careful, and close enough to touch what belonged to Daniel. Close enough to mark the page and close enough to mark me now. I pressed my palms to the table, breathing slowly, deliberately, trying to anchor myself. The house seemed to exhale with me, settling, but the shadows pressed against the walls, reminding me of the weight still in the room. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards behind me, the subtle press of presence that had not moved, not yet, waiting. And I realized that the warning had never been about leaving or following. It had been about recognition, about seeing the threat in plain sight, about understanding that someone could wear Daniel's name as a mask, and that mask could move silently into our lives. I ran my fingers over the letter one last time, feeling the tremor in the paper, the warmth of his hand, the faint ghost of the intruder's writing. My mind traced every step from the woods, from the clearing, from the frost, to this room, to this moment. The realization pressed into me like ice, sharp and undeniable. Daniel had tried to protect me. He had tried to leave a trace. And now, the trace had led me here, to the presence waiting quietly, deliberately, just beyond the door. I didn't reach for the doorknob. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply pressed the letter to my side, letting the final line echo in the silent house. He took my name. The shadows stretched long, the light fading across the table, the presence waiting, patient, deliberate. I could feel it in the floorboards, the walls, the air around me, in every corner of the house that had once felt so safe. And then the door creaked again, just slightly, a whisper of motion in the quiet. My chest tightened, a low ache spreading through my shoulders, and I understood fully that the story had not ended. The warning had come to life. The intruder had taken the final step from paper into presence. And I was not alone. I pressed my hand against the table, feeling the rough edge of the paper, the tremor of the ink, the warning pressing into my palm. The shadows moved slightly, patient, deliberate, waiting. I felt the warmth of the letter against the chill of the room, the memory of Daniel's hand and the ghost of someone else's. And I whispered, almost to myself, almost to the house. He took my name. The door creaked again. And I knew in that instant that someone was standing in my house now.